that in English, it's okay. If you do that in Korean, I will translate. So if you have a question, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask your question or comments. 질문이나 코멘트가 있으신 분들은 손을 들고 표시해 주시면 먼저 자기를 소개하시고 질문이나 코멘트를 해주시겠습니다. Okay, please.
Timidity is not known at the Handong Global University, I understand. You are all ambitious and aggressive young students who are ready to take on the world. So take your first shot and let's start our conversation.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Eugene.
I can't see you. Where are you? There you go.
My name is Eugene, and you have mentioned that not taking into account human sinfulness and righteousness can be politically dangerous. What do you mean by that?
Well, the worry is, with very optimistic views of human nature, that we do not put sufficient safeguards on the exercise of authority, and particularly the exercise of state authority, which has, by definition, the coercive power of the sword behind it. And one of the issues that emerge in the tradition is trying to decide, on the one hand, how we construct the state, consistent with the teaching of Scripture that says that the powers are ordained by God, that we have to obey those authorities because they are exercising God's authorities as vice-regents on this earth. And the reality, the brute reality, that many that occupy that political office convert that office into an instrument of self-gain. They follow their own sinful proclivities. They ultimately become abusive, sometimes tyrannical. And the question becomes, how do you, on the strength of Luther's insight into the twofold nature of humanity and the necessity for restraint and limitation upon the exercise of an individual in his or own life, project that idea onto constructions of restraints on the political office? In a day when the absolute right of kings, the absolute monarchy rules were very powerfully enunciated in Catholic and Protestant circles alike, one of the gradual responses to that reality of the sinful and saintly person occupying the political office and eventually the ecclesiastical office was to figure out, well, what kind of constitutional safeguards need to be put in place so that political offices and ecclesiastical offices do not become instruments of self-gain. And we begin to see in the later 16th and 17th centuries a repackaging of traditional and an invention of new sets of constitutional safeguards. An emphasis upon separation of powers and the need to ensure that different authorities discharge different pieces of the political office. Checks and balances between those powers such that one can check the excesses of the other. Limited terms of office rather than lifetime appointments, where a party needs to step out of office rather than using his time or her time in that office to eventually subdue that office into their own self-gain. The idea of democratic election, the notion that a person should be elected as a representative of God, but also a representative of all God's image bearers that are sitting in the citizenry and have the right to vote. The notion that between elections we need to have opportunities for meetings, town meetings and congregational meetings, where the authorities can give an account of themselves and the people can petition and state their grievances without rioting, without revolt, but with studied and insistent demands upon what they think are important to the polity. The idea of codified law rather than simply untethered equity, such that rules and regulations are set down for people to understand and can abide by them, and they bind not only the people, but also bind the authorities to uphold them. And the idea, ultimately, of civil disobedience and, if necessary, democratic revolt. If notwithstanding all of those safeguards, notwithstanding all of the limitations that are imposed upon the office of especially the state, that the people have the right and the people have the duty to rise up in rebellion. One of the stories of the later 16th and 17th century in Protestant lands is the energizing of these democratic revolutions when the safeguards themselves were not present or when those constitutional safeguards gave way. And what's interesting, especially in the colonial American context, and a bit also in the Dutch and Scottish and German Palatinate context, is the same kind of constitutional constructions being put in place within the church itself. And the idea of the democratic church polity and all these same safeguards put in place. Executive, legislative, and judicial authority now is pastoral and diaconal and disciplinary authority. We do have election to the church pulpit. We do have congregational meetings. We do have clearly codified creeds and confessions and articulations of the faith to which everyone is bound. We do have the opportunity for impeachment or removal of the ecclesiastic from office. And all those are interesting ways that emerge in the Protestant tradition as in part a response to this idea of political danger, of rosy and optimistic views of human nature. And then the flip side of it is, which I won't dwell on at length, is the necessity of law and the necessity of rules for a community. And given the proclivity of folk to follow their depraved instincts, to let the law teach them the good ways that please the polity and the good ways that please God. And to the extent that those people defy that set of invitations and instructions, to find ways within the constraints of due process, retributing the wrong and making it right to the extent possible, and seeking eventually to rehabilitate, to reform, to bring that person back into line with his moral duties toward God, toward the state, and toward his or her neighbor.
Okay. Yes, okay, thank you. And any other questions? Okay, please.
My name is Sumin Park, and in your third point, you said that heaven will be filled with pure law, but as I remember, heaven is supposed to be a place of happiness and freedom. But isn't law somehow to be a kind of restraint in some manner?
So the last riff in response to Grant Gilmore is in part tongue-in-cheek, but it's in part serious. And it's the argument that the medievalists already recognized when they said in the Sachsenspiegel of 1220, God is law, and therefore law is dear to him. And the idea is that law in its ultimate sanction and source lies in God, in the Godhead itself. And the notion that in paradise already, as God is constructing his order, he is engaging in lawmaking. And God said, let there be, let there be, let there be, let there be. And in every day of creation, there is response to God's directive. And it's inherent in the construction of the perfect order of creation before the fall that there is law. There's no question that after the fall, law takes on additional functions. There's no question that there are new layers of authority that are made necessary by the fall. As James Madison says in Federalist Paper number 78, if all men were angels, we really wouldn't need law in that restrained, coercive sense of the term. But men are not angels. And because of that, we need auxiliary expedients, he says, in the form of law. And so I would say that as we think about law in a variety of different valences, and a variety of different octaves of its expression, the most essential part of law is that God is a ruler, that God is the commander of the universe, that God ultimately, and that Christ is the King of Kings. And inherent in those divine offices, which are going to be expressed, in my view, in the heavens above, if God gives me grace to get there, is that we are going to be ruled by pure law, rather than ruled by partial laws, by constraint, by coercion. And that the rule of law is the source of liberty, is the source of opportunity to exercise one's human nature, now redeemed most fully. A follow-up, I understand, yeah.
I still have a question.
Yeah, please.
So, what you mean is that, well, law was initially supposed to make people happy and well-living and prosperous.
Prosperous, I'm not sure.
Then, how about the laws today? I mean, in society, especially in Korea, I've seen a lot of people who has been kind of unhappy, if you say, after their judgments and others. So, if a law doesn't help you, then does that mean that it's not a good law, I guess?
So how a law operates in an individual case where there are winners and losers by definition is one matter, and a person can feel that he or she's been unjustly treated in the case below and can appeal that case, and ultimately the final resolution will be reached by the highest court that has jurisdiction. Sometimes those appeals provide middle ways. Sometimes those appeals confirm the judgment below. There are winners and losers in a litigation society, and that's inevitable. At a broader level, there are laws that are passed by the state as either prophylactics or directives or encouragements or facilitations or regulations on broader sets of human conduct. And sometimes those laws, when they are passed, also give people pause. And the response to those laws is in part to seek their change, seek their repeal, seek their amendment, to test their constitutional edges, and to do what's necessary as a citizenry to ensure that one can live consistently with that law, but also exercise the opportunities for dissent. There is an appropriate place, in my view, which Scripture, I think, condones in especially Acts 5, where we must worship God rather than men. And when the law puts us in a context of forcing us to abandon our Christian duties, our religious duties, and forces a crisis of conscience to abide by the law, you have the right and you have the duty to resist, not to obey the law, to move to a place where such a law doesn't operate, to seek changes in the law when necessary, and take the consequences of that civil disobedience. And I'm still of a mind, old-fashioned Calvinist that I am, that there is a place for revolt. There is a place for revolution. And while less common today than it historically was, there is a God-given responsibility that the people have to exercise God's authority, whose images they actually bear and whose ambassadorship they must discharge. And in some instances, through due procedure and constitutional means, revolt against our legal system is appropriate. And if you ask our friends in various communist lands, ask our friends under colonial autocracies, ask people that have lived under tyranny, that idea is real for them, and alas, still too real around the world today.
Okay, next question. Okay, you first, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah and I'm an undergrad. And from what you have said, Luther emphasized priesthood, all believers. And one aspect of Korean society is that there's too much emphasis on vocation. And I think that Handong is definitely not free from such influence. Moreover, I think vocation, the job. And moreover, I think that in Korean society, there's a tendency to depend on priests in terms of knowledge about God. And what I mean is that it seems like we have less duty in terms of being priesthood. So I have two questions. First, I cannot grasp Luther's expectation on simple believers like me in terms of being priest. And my second question is, what would Luther have said in terms of vocation and priesthood as to how to relate them together so that vocation does not become our idols?
I recommend to Dean Enlow that you take her into the law school. I think she'll be a very good jurist to have on your team. You're accepted, I think he's just told. Tuition waived, come on. So Luther draws a distinction between a whole series of offices that a Christian must discharge. A person sits in a number of different communities, sometimes naturally and sometimes voluntarily. And in each of those communities has a set of responsibilities that attach to him or her. You're a child. As a child, you honor and obey your parents. You're a parent, and you care and nurture and educate your children. You are part of a broader network of relationships in your neighborhood, and you have duties to discharge to loving your neighbor. You are a member of a church, and in that church you have duties to discharge as a congregant in that church, and sometimes a person who takes on discrete offices. You are a citizen of the state and have certain obligations you must discharge by nature. But one of the things that Luther is emphasizing is that there are a variety of different occupations and offices that a person, just by living in community, has. And each of them has certain expectations attached to them. Each of them has certain rights that are inherent in them. And each of them gives that person some bounding in how he or she operates. What he's lifting up in this passage of the freedom of a Christian is a biblical trope about a person being a prophet, a priest, and a king. And to sit as imitators of Christ. We imitate Christ and we follow Christ and we manifest Christ as prophets who speak, as priests who serve, as kings who participate in rule of our communities. And that triplex munus Christi, as it's called historically, the three offices of Christ, are in part obligations that a person needs to discharge, which in some sense transcend the particular obligations of each of the offices they inhabit by reason of birth or by reason of voluntary association. And then on top of that, Luther then talks about, even though everybody's put into these relationships, and even though everyone's called to follow Christ in the prophethood, priesthood, and kingship of believers, a person also trains him or herself for a vocation. The vocation being the place where that person feels called to discharge discrete responsibilities in their community. Their job, their profession, or the thing that they occupy. And what Luther is trying to do there is to say that the old medieval distinction that the true vocation is that of the cleric and everybody else just does some things is in many ways misguided, and that everybody has a vocation. The housewife, the fisherman, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the magistrate, the cleric, everybody enjoys an invitation from God by giving them gifts and giving them abilities to find the vocation where they can ultimately discharge their talents in the most responsible way. That's his construction of these three layers of sets of responsibilities, with the vocation being, in some sense, the distillation and the topping on all of those other responsibilities in life. Your question then presses on, well, look, vocationalism, professionalism, the job that one inhabits today is really becoming all-consuming. And it comes increasingly at the cost of these two layers of responsibility that you have beneath. It's very difficult to be a parent as well as a very busy professional. It's very difficult to be a prophet, priest, and king when your vocation cabins what you're allowed to say or do. And that tension is a real tension, which Luther himself recognized and respected. What Luther warned against is vocationalism, when that vocation itself is reduced to an idol, is reduced to an ism, is reduced to something that one pursues for one's own sake. And vocations are always opportunities to serve God, he says. And if you're no longer serving God in your vocation, if your vocation doesn't allow you to serve God, back to the Acts 5 passage, now it's time to find another one. Because that, in some sense, is a barrier against your ability to discharge all three layers of responsibility that we find ourselves in. But in modern life, that emphasis on vocation, that emphasis on professionalism, that emphasis on the job, born in part of the increasing demands of the marketplace, born in part of the economic dislocations that we face and the harder work that we have to do just to keep up with the pace that our parents and grandparents kept, and the reality that you are being forced, especially as budding professionals in medicine or in law or in other high professions, you're in many ways being forced to choose between being a parent or being a professional, being a spouse or being a professional, And that kind of tension is real, is palpable, and Luther's only answer to that is work harder to find a profession in which you do not have to make those sacrifices, or find a context in which you can do these in layers. And I always tell people that you have to realize your generation is going to live and work until you're 80 or 85. And you have to think about life in a lot longer swath than a 16th century Protestant reformer or even our grandparents or parents. That is, the old idea was you go to school, you get your job, you retire, you die. And you had a kind of a 20-year run-up, you work for 30 years, and then you die or retire. And now increasingly you have a 60-year window to work with. And you have to think about that longer window as you begin to think horizontally about how to discharge all of those vocations. And women, forgive me for addressing you in that respect, have a particularly difficult issue of childbirth and the procreative window. And the reality that from 18 to 35, 38, those are the natural times for childbearing, and becomes more risky to your health and to that of your child when you postpone procreation till your middle age. But it's exactly the time in many professions where the demands on you are so heavy. So one of the things I try to encourage my students to think about is segmenting their life. There's nothing wrong with getting your education, getting married, having your kids, getting your kids prepared for life, and then doing the professional application of your work. And increasingly, I'm getting classes full of 35-year-old women who are finding themselves having done this and finding satisfaction in the work, knowing that just like their grandparents, they have 30 or 40 years of work ahead of them, but they have also discharged the responsibility at home. And I'm not pushing that as an agenda, but I'm simply saying there is a way to reimagine vocation making in a world where medical science has made lifespans and where economic necessity has made work spans that much larger and longer.
Thank you. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, all the other behind, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. My name is Joel Shi, Korean Shadow State math student. You mentioned the Protestant theory of liberty is that we are all laws on this earth. I think this is a very controversial sentence because we are the steward of the earth. What is the meaning? My question is, what is the meaning and the context of laws?
Forgive me if I didn't get the subtlety of your question, but I heard you say that what does the idea of lordship of office have to do with stewardship of the earth? And does stewardship of the earth, is that entailed in what we do as lords on this earth? Is that a proper distillation of your question?
Yes.
So the issue of stewardship, dress and keep the garden. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth, but at the same time dress and keep the earth. And that we carry with us the responsibility, as our Jewish brothers and sisters say, that in many ways our job is to improve and to realize the potential of the created order. And to the extent that we can do that consistent with our obligation to preserve the created order as trustees, as stewards for what God has given us, is absolutely indispensable. And one of the ways that we've come to realize that in the 20th and 21st century, with the ravages of the Industrial Revolution and the ravages of the two world wars, is to begin to realize that that precious, precious commodity called the earth and nature and its resources, its plants and animals and water, are things that we collectively have an obligation, regardless of what vocation, regardless of what lordship we discharge, to participate in protecting. I'm not a tree hugger, but I am very aware of especially in crowded places of the world that we find here, especially in China, in crowded metropolis areas like we have on the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. The obligations that we have in inhabiting those places forces us to think very hard about avoiding smash and grab capitalism and thinking a lot harder about environmental goods. And there is a movement afoot that you might hear about a little from Professor Lien tomorrow about third-generation rights and so forth, and trees having standing. And that, I think, is a misguided way of thinking about pressing for the claims of nature. But I do think what's inherent in that third-generation rights movement is in part a recognition that somehow, with our impoverished rights vocabulary in the 21st century, we need to find a way of standing up vicariously for nature. And that's what's pushing that, and in that basic sentiment, I happen to find congenial. And I think it's built right into the creation mandate itself.
Thank you. Yes, is there still a question over there? Yeah?
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. My name is Yen, and do correct me, sorry if I'm wrong, but when Luther comments on the concept of human rights, when he has said that rights and duties go hand in hand, I understood to ask, so does that mean that the rights that we deserve are reserved by the duties that we carry out? So if we do not carry out our duties or the acts that we should do, then we do not deserve the rights that should protect us. So when he said rights and duties go together, then if one is absent, then do we not deserve the other?
Yeah. I wouldn't say, so a couple things. Number one, Luther doesn't have a fully developed theory of rights. Luther has scratchings in the direction